My name is Hannah, 45 years old, and I've lost the person who mattered most to me because I couldn't face the truth. Growing up in suburban Boston taught me to keep family matters private, even when they're destroying you from within. Behind our picture-perfect life, I chose comfort over courage, denial over love. The price. My son Ethan walked away and never looked back. Before I share how I lost my son, let me know where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you've ever struggled with facing painful family truths. The hardest lessons often come when we're too afraid to see what's right in front of us. I grew up in a household where appearances mattered more than anything else. My parents were masters of the phrase, "What will people think?" We lived in a beautiful colonial house with shutters painted the perfect shade of blue, and not once did the neighbors hear our arguments or see my father's disapproving glares. My mother taught me the art of smiling through pain, of keeping secrets wrapped tightly inside our four walls. When I met James during my sophomore year of college, I was immediately drawn to him. He was everything my parents would approve of: handsome, intelligent, ambitious, and charming. He had a confidence that filled every room, and when he focused his attention on me, I felt special in a way I never had before. We dated for 3 years before getting married in a picture-perfect ceremony that made my mother cry happy tears. We settled in a beautiful suburb outside of Seattle, where James quickly climbed the corporate ladder at his law firm. Within 5 years, we had the life I'd been programmed to want. The spacious house with the manicured lawn, the luxury car in the driveway, invitations to all the right parties. I worked part-time at the local library, which gave me both independence and flexibility. From the outside, we were living the American dream. When Ethan was born, something inside me shifted. The moment they placed him in my arms, I felt a fierce protectiveness I'd never experienced. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I made a silent promise to always keep him safe. He had James' dark hair, but my green eyes, and I spent hours just watching him sleep, marveling at this perfect little person we'd created. The first years of Ethan's life were filled with the usual joys and challenges of parenthood. James was busy building his career as a corporate lawyer, often working late hours and traveling for business. When he was home, he was loving but distracted checking emails while Ethan showed him a new toy or answering calls during family dinner. I told myself this was normal, that he was working hard for our family's future. Looking back, I can see the early warning signs that I so willfully ignored. The way James would criticize my parenting decisions in front of others, making them sound like jokes, but leaving them to sting. The times he'd come home stressed and expect the house to be perfectly quiet because he'd had a hard day. The subtle ways he'd undermine my authority with Ethan telling him, "Mom doesn't know what she's talking about," when I'd set a boundary. As Ethan grew, it became clear he was a sensitive, thoughtful child. By kindergarten, he showed remarkable talent for drawing and would spend hours creating intricate pictures of animals and fantasy worlds. He loved books and would sit in my lap at the library where I worked, soaking up stories like a sponge. His teachers called him empathetic, and creative qualities I cherished in him. James, however, seemed increasingly disappointed in his son. When Ethan was 7, James signed him up for baseball without consulting either of us. Ethan tried his best, but he wasn't naturally athletic and preferred sketching in the dugout to being in the field. I still remember the car ride home after Ethan missed catching a fly ball that would have won the game. "You need to toughen up," James said, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "No son of mine is going to be some sissy who can't catch a ball." Ethan shrank into the back seat, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "He's just learning, James," I said softly. "He'll get better with practice." "Or maybe he'd get better if he paid attention instead of daydreaming all the time," James snapped. I turned around and gave Ethan a reassuring smile, but I didn't challenge James further. This became our pattern. James would criticize, Ethan would withdraw, and I would offer minimal protection before retreating into peacekeeping mode. When Ethan was 8, he spent an entire weekend working on an art project for school, a detailed diorama of the rainforest complete with handcrafted animals and trees. He was so proud of it, carefully placing each element just so. The night before it was due, James came home from a business trip in a foul mood. He saw the art supplies spread across the dining table and exploded. "What is this mess we eat here, Hannah?" He turned to Ethan. "This is wasteful. All this money spent on art supplies when you should be focusing on real subjects." Before either of us could respond, James swept his arm across the table, sending the diorama crashing to the floor. The careful work of an 8-year-old boy lay shattered on our pristine hardwood. Ethan didn't cry. He just looked at his destroyed creation, then at his father, then at me, waiting to see what I would do. And what did I do? I started picking up the pieces, saying in a cheerful voice that was almost manic, "It's okay, we can fix this. We'll stay up tonight and make it even better." James walked away to pour himself a scotch, and Ethan silently helped me gather the broken pieces of his project. Later that night, after we'd reconstructed what we could, Ethan asked me, "Why is Dad always mad at me?" "He's not mad at you, honey," I said, smoothing his hair. "He just had a bad day at work. He wants what's best for you." Even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. But I told myself that James was just being a strict parent, that his high expectations would benefit Ethan in the long run. I convinced myself that what happened wasn't abuse. It was just an unfortunate incident, a momentary loss of temper. That night was the first time I actively chose the comfort of denial over the courage of confrontation. It wouldn't be the last. As Ethan entered his teenage years, the distance between him and James grew into a chasm. My son became increasingly withdrawn, retreating into his art and books, where he found the safety our home no longer provided. He'd come home from school and go straight to his room, emerging only for dinner, where conversation was stilted and tense. James's criticism of Ethan became more pointed, more personal. It wasn't just about Ethan's interests anymore. It was about who he was as a person. Despite Ethan consistently bringing home A's and B's, James would focus on the occasional B-, questioning why Ethan couldn't do better. "Harvard doesn't accept mediocrity," James would say, though Ethan was only 14 and had never expressed interest in Harvard. I tried to be the bridge between them, the peacekeeper who smoothed over James's harsh words and encouraged Ethan to understand his father's perspective. I'd follow up James's criticism with platitudes like, "Your father just wants you to succeed," or "He has high standards because he believes in you." The truth I wouldn't admit was that nothing Ethan did would ever be good enough for James. When Ethan made the school's art honor roll in 9th grade, bringing home a certificate and having one of his pieces displayed in the main hallway, James barely glanced at the achievement. "Art honor roll?" he scoffed when Ethan showed him the certificate at dinner. "Let me know when you make the math honor roll. That's something that will actually get you somewhere in life." Ethan's face fell, but he'd learned not to show his hurt too openly around his father. I jumped in with my usual buffer. "James, this is a real achievement. Less than 10 students made it." I turned to Ethan with forced brightness. "We're going to frame this, honey. I'm so proud of you." But my words rang hollow because they weren't backed by action. I never confronted James about his dismissal of our son's talents. I never put my foot down and demanded respect for Ethan. I just tried to minimize the damage after it was done. Around this time, James's drinking became more noticeable. What had once been a single scotch after work became 2 or 3. Weekends often involved a constant buzz from afternoon until bedtime. The more he drank, the more cutting his comments became, not just toward Ethan, but toward me as well. Our home developed an unmistakable atmosphere. We were all walking on eggshells around James. I began to warn Ethan before his father got home. "Dad had a tough day at the office, so let's keep things quiet tonight." Or, "Maybe save showing him your art project for the weekend when he's more relaxed." I was teaching my son to make himself smaller to hide his light so it wouldn't irritate his father. And all the while I told myself I was helping, that I was maintaining peace in our home. Ethan's art from this period speaks volumes about what he was experiencing. His earlier work had been bright and fantastical, imaginary creatures and colorful landscapes. But as he moved through middle school and into high school, his art darkened. He drew solitary figures in vast, empty spaces, faces partially obscured by shadow barriers and walls featuring prominently. His art teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, called me in for a conference when Ethan was 15. "Hannah," she said gently, "Ethan is incredibly talented, but I'm concerned about the themes in his work. There's a lot of isolation, a sense of being trapped. When I've asked him about it, he says it's just his artistic style, but as someone who's worked with teenagers for 20 years, I'm seeing some red flags." I assured her that everything was fine at home, that Ethan was just going through a phase that all teenagers feel misunderstood. I believed my own lies because the alternative was too frightening to face. The summer when Ethan was 16, we took a family vacation to a lake house in northern Washington. James had been particularly stressed at work, dealing with a high-profile case that wasn't going well. He'd been drinking more heavily and had less patience than usual. One evening, after James had several beers, Ethan mentioned that he was thinking of applying to art schools after graduation. "Art school?" James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No son of mine is wasting my money on some useless art degree. You'll go to a real university and study something practical. Business, law, medicine. Something that can actually support a family." "But I don't want to do those things," Ethan said quietly. It was one of the few times he'd directly challenged his father's vision for his future. "Want?" James's voice rose. "You think life is about what you want. Life is about responsibility, about making something of yourself. Your little drawings are a hobby, not a career." I watched Ethan's face flush with hurt and anger. I should have stepped in, should have defended his dreams. Instead, I placed my hand on Ethan's arm and said, "Let's talk about this another time. Dad's tired, and we're on vacation." Later that night, when Ethan and I were alone doing dishes, he asked me, "Do you think my art is just a hobby too?" "Of course not, honey," I said. "You're very talented, but maybe your father has a point about keeping options open. Art can be a tough field to succeed in." "You always do that," Ethan said, putting down the dish towel. "Do what?" "Pretend to be on my side, but then agree with him. You never actually stand up for me." His words stung because they contained the truth I was trying so hard to avoid. But instead of acknowledging it, I became defensive. "That's not fair, Ethan. I'm trying to help you understand your father's perspective. You need to try harder with him. He loves you. He just shows it differently." Ethan looked at me for a long moment, his eyes sad beyond his years. "Yeah, Mom. I'll try harder." He walked away, and I felt the distance between us grow. I'd failed him again, choosing the path of least resistance over standing by his side. It was becoming a pattern I couldn't break. James would hurt Ethan, I would comfort him, but ultimately urge him to adapt to his father's expectations, rather than expecting James to change. I was teaching my son that his feelings didn't matter, that appeasing his father was more important than being true to himself. And all the while, I told myself I was preserving our family, keeping the peace, when in reality, I was sacrificing my son's well-being for the illusion of harmony. Everything came to a head the fall of Ethan's senior year. He was 17, preparing college applications, and focused primarily on art schools. RISD Pratt Institute, Cal Arts. He'd been working with Mrs. Abernathy on his portfolio, staying late after school several days a week. His talent was undeniable, and she believed he had a real shot at scholarships. I supported his efforts, secretly driving him to portfolio review days when James was out of town, helping him photograph his work, reading his application essays. but I never openly advocated for his path when James was present. I kept playing both sides, telling myself I was being diplomatic when really I was being cowardly. One October evening, James came home early and found Ethan and me at the dining room table surrounded by art school brochures. I saw immediate fury in his eyes, but hoped we could have a rational conversation. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet as he set down his briefcase. "College applications," I said, trying to sound casual. "Ethan's got some great options." James picked up the RISD brochure, looking at it with contempt. "This doesn't look like Georgetown or Yale." "Dad, I told you I want to study art," Ethan said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of tension. "These are the best schools for what I want to do." "What you want to do?" James repeated mockingly. "And how exactly do you plan to support yourself with this art degree you think companies are lining up to hire people who can draw pretty pictures?" "Actually, there are lots of careers in art and design," Ethan countered. "Mrs. Abernathy has been helping me research." "Mrs. Abernathy?" James interrupted. "Your art teacher. Of course she'd encourage this nonsense. It validates her own useless career choice." I saw Ethan's hands clench into fists under the table. "Don't talk about her like that. She's a great teacher." James slammed his hand down on the table, making us both jump. "I've had enough of this. You're not throwing away your future on some artistic pipe dream. No son of mine is going to end up a starving artist, or worse, coming back to live in my basement because he can't find a job with his worthless degree." "It's not worthless," Ethan said, his voice rising to match his father's. "Just because you don't understand or value something doesn't make it worthless." James's face darkened, and he leaned in toward Ethan. "You watch your tone with me, boy. You live under my roof, you'll follow my rules, and my rules say no art school." "I've already applied," Ethan said defiantly. "And when I get in, I'm going with or without your support." James moved so quickly I barely had time to register what was happening. He swept his arm across the table, sending brochures and application papers flying across the room. Then he was directly in front of Ethan, towering over him, fists clenched at his sides. "You ungrateful little shit," he hissed. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me, by throwing away every opportunity I've worked to give you." Ethan stood up, and I was startled to see that he was nearly as tall as his father now. "You haven't done anything for me," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've spent my entire life trying to make me into someone I'm not. You've never once supported the things I care about. You've never been proud of me for who I actually am." "Proud," James laughed bitterly. "What exactly should I be proud of? Your mediocre grades, your weird art obsession, the way you skulk around this house like some misunderstood victim." "Stop it, James," I finally interjected, but my voice was weak, ineffectual. Ethan wasn't backing down. Years of pent-up pain came pouring out. "You've been putting me down my entire life. Nothing I do is ever good enough for you. You've made me feel worthless since I was a kid. You call me names, you belittle my interests, you drink too much, and then take your frustrations out on me and Mom." James's face was purple with rage. He stepped even closer to Ethan, his body language threatening. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a child." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Ethan continued, his voice stronger now. "You're emotionally abusive, Dad. That's what this is. It's abuse." The word hung in the air between us, the terrible truth finally spoken aloud. I felt as though I couldn't breathe. This was the moment when everything could change, when we could finally acknowledge the reality we'd been living with for years. And what did I do in this crucial moment? I panicked. I chose preservation of our family illusion over protection of my son. "Ethan," I gasped, "you can't say things like that. Your father has done everything for this family. He worked so hard to give us this life. Ethan turned to me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. Are you serious right now, Mom? After everything you've seen, everything you've experienced yourself, you're still defending him. I'm not defending anyone. I'm just saying that abuse is a very serious accusation, I stammered. Your father can be stern. Yes, and maybe he doesn't always understand your interests, but that doesn't mean what, Mom? Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet now. That doesn't mean it's abuse when he destroys my things, when he calls me worthless, when he makes me feel like I'm nothing, when he makes you walk on eggshells in your own home. I looked at my son standing tall and speaking truth, and I failed him in the worst possible way. I think you're overreacting, Ethan, I said. You're making things sound worse than they are. Every family has disagreements, especially during stressful times like college applications. You're blowing this out of proportion. The look that came over Ethan's face in that moment haunts me to this day. It was more than hurt. It was betrayal in its purest form. I had just confirmed his worst fear, that I would never truly protect him, that I would always choose the comfort of denial over facing the painful truth. Overreacting, he repeated softly. Making things up. He nodded slowly, as if coming to a profound understanding. Without another word, he gathered a few of his papers from the floor and walked upstairs to his room. I heard the door close and the lock click. James looked triumphant. He needs to learn respect, he said, pouring himself a scotch. He'll come around once he realizes how ridiculous he's being. I said nothing, frozen in the aftermath of my betrayal. I'd just lost something precious, but I couldn't yet admit what it was. That night, I lay awake beside James, who fell into a scotch-induced sleep without a care in the world. I told myself that I'd done the right thing, that acknowledging abuse would have torn our family apart, that Ethan would understand when he was older and had a family of his own. I constructed elaborate justifications for my cowardice, building a fortress of denial so sturdy, I almost believed it myself. The next morning, Ethan was gone before I woke up. Left early for school, according to the brief note on the counter. I went through my day at the library in a fog of anxiety, checking my phone constantly for messages that never came. When I got home, I busied myself making dinner, trying to create a sense of normalcy. I heard Ethan come home and go straight upstairs. After an hour, I called him down for dinner. When he appeared in the doorway to the dining room, my heart stopped. He had a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a backpack on his back. Ethan, what's going on? I asked, though I knew the answer already. I'm leaving, he said simply. I'm going to stay with Aunt Sophia. James looked up from his plate. Don't be dramatic. Sit down and eat your dinner. Ethan ignored him and looked directly at me. I called Sophia this afternoon. She's on her way to pick me up. She said I can stay with her until graduation. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Ethan, please, let's talk about this. I know you're upset about yesterday, but running away isn't the answer. I'm not running away, he said, his voice steady. I'm removing myself from an unhealthy environment. That's what my counselor at school advised when I talked to her today. You talked to a counselor? I was aghast. About our private family matters? The look Ethan gave me was so adult, so clear-eyed, that I hardly recognized my own child. Yes, Mom. Because what's happening in this house isn't normal or healthy. And if you can't see that, then I need to protect myself, because clearly no one else will. I felt tears welling in my eyes. Ethan, please, we can work this out. I'll do better, I promise. It's too late, Mom. You've had years to do better to stand up for me. Yesterday just showed me where your loyalties really are. James pushed back from the table. If you walk out that door, don't expect any financial support for college. Not one penny. Ethan didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on me as he said, "Sophia already talked to her lawyer. She's going to help me apply for independent student status for financial aid. And she's going to let me live with her while I go to community college and build my portfolio if I don't get enough scholarship money this year." The doorbell rang. Sophia right on time. I felt desperate, frantic. "Ethan, please don't do this. We're your family." "Family is supposed to make you feel safe," he said. "I've never felt safe here." As he turned to leave, I grabbed his arm. "Ethan, please. I'm your mother." He looked down at my hand, then back at my face. "You chose your comfort over my safety. I won't make you choose anymore." Then he was gone, walking out the door with my sister, who didn't even look at me as they loaded his bags into her car and drove away. James's reaction was predictably dismissive. "He'll be back when he realizes how good he had it here. Let him have his tantrum." But I knew in the deepest part of my heart that Ethan wouldn't be back. I had lost my son, not in that moment, but in 1,000 moments before, when I chose silence over speaking up, when I chose the illusion of family over the reality of his suffering. I had failed in the most fundamental duty of a parent, to protect my child, and I would spend years trying to find a way back from that failure. The house felt impossibly empty after Ethan left. I wandered from room to room, touching his things. The books on his shelf, the sketch pads he'd left behind, the sweatshirt hanging on his desk chair. Everything felt like evidence of a crime I'd been complicit in. My phone rang the morning after he left. It was Sophia, and her voice was ice cold. "I can't believe you, Hannah," she said without preamble. "All these years, I suspected something wasn't right in your house, but I never imagined you'd actually side with James over your own son." "I didn't side with James," I protested weakly. "I was just trying to keep things from escalating." "Bullshit," Sophia shot back. "Ethan told me everything. How James has been emotionally abusing him for years. How you've been making excuses, minimizing telling Ethan to try harder when it's James who's the problem." "That's not fair," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "You don't understand how complicated it is." "It's not complicated, Hannah. It's actually very simple. Your husband is abusive, and instead of protecting your son, you enabled the abuse. And now you've lost him." Her words cut through my defenses like a knife. "Is he okay?" I asked in a small voice. "No, he's not okay," Sophia said. "He's devastated, not just by James's behavior, which he's come to expect, but by your betrayal. He always thought that deep down, you knew the truth and would eventually stand up for him. Finding out that you actually believe he's overreacting broke something in him." "I don't really believe that," I whispered. "I was just scared." "Well, your fear has cost you your relationship with your son," Sophia said. "I'm going to help him however I can, but I want to be clear. I'm on Ethan's side here. If you want any relationship with him going forward, you need to take a hard look at yourself and your marriage." After she hung up, I sat in Ethan's room and cried until I had no tears left. Without Ethan as a buffer and target, James's behavior toward me worsened. His criticism became more frequent, his drinking heavier. I started to see with painful clarity what Ethan had been trying to tell me. That this wasn't a normal marriage, that James's behavior wasn't just being stern or having high standards. But I still couldn't find the courage to leave. I tried to maintain contact with Ethan, sending him daily texts that he rarely answered. When he did respond, it was with brief, factual replies. "Yes, I'm fine. School is fine. No, I don't need anything." I clung to my denial like a lifeline, still trying to frame what happened as a temporary family disagreement rather than the culmination of years of abuse. I sent Ethan messages that revealed my continued blindness. "Dad and I miss you so much. The house is so quiet without you. Dad's just been under a lot of stress at work lately. I know things got heated, but we can work this out as a family. Ethan's responses became less and less frequent until they stopped altogether. When graduation day came, I sat in the back of the auditorium, watching my son receive his diploma. He'd graduated with honors and won an art scholarship. James refused to attend, saying Ethan had made his choice and now had to live with it. I sent Ethan a text afterward telling him how proud I was. He didn't respond. I mailed him a card with a check inside, money I'd been saving secretly for years. I wrote that I loved him and was sorry for everything, though I still couldn't bring myself to name exactly what I was sorry for. The envelope came back a week later, unopened, marked, "Return to sender." The rejection was absolute. The summer after Ethan left was the loneliest of my life. I went through the motions at work, came home to a house that felt like a mausoleum, and tried to ignore the increasing frequency of James's angry outbursts. Without Ethan to focus on, I became the sole target of his dissatisfaction. One evening in July, I was cleaning Ethan's room when I found a stack of his old journals hidden in the back of his closet. I knew I shouldn't read them. They were private, but I was desperate for some connection to my son. What I found in those pages broke me open. Ethan had been documenting his father's behavior since he was 12 years old. Page after page detailed incidents I'd forgotten or minimized. James throwing a plate against the wall when dinner wasn't to his liking, James calling Ethan a disappointment when he quit the debate team, James mocking Ethan's appearance when he went through an awkward growth spurt. And woven throughout were observations about me. Mom just looked away again. Mom told me afterward that Dad didn't mean it, but I know he did. I wish Mom would just once stand up to him, just once choose me. Reading those words, I finally allowed myself to cry for everything my son had endured and for my role in his suffering. The carefully constructed walls of denial began to crumble around me. A week later, I ran into Mrs. Abernathy, Ethan's art teacher, at the grocery store. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. "How's Ethan doing?" she asked. "I heard he's living with his aunt now." "He's okay, I think," I said. We're not talking much right now." She nodded as if this didn't surprise her. "You know, Hannah, I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of kids express their pain through art. Ethan's work was some of the most heartbreaking I've ever encountered." "What do you mean?" "His technical skill is extraordinary, but it was the content that concerned me. So much isolation, so many barriers. In his senior portfolio, he did a series called Unheard. Figures with their mouths open in silent screams surrounded by people with their backs turned. I felt sick knowing I was one of those figures with my back turned. "I tried to talk to him about it," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "He would just say it was artistic expression. But art doesn't lie, Hannah. It shows us what we can't or won't say out loud." As she walked away, I stood frozen in the middle of the produce section, finally confronting the truth: I had failed my son. I had witnessed his pain day after day, year after year, and done nothing substantial to stop it. Worse, when he finally found the courage to name what was happening, I had told him he was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Ethan's face when I told him he was overreacting, the hope dying in his eyes as he realized I wouldn't help him. For the first time, I allowed myself to use the word that Ethan had used: abuse. My husband was abusive, and I had been his enabler. The realization didn't immediately give me courage. I was still afraid of James, still economically dependent on him, still caught in patterns established over decades. But something had shifted inside me. I could no longer pretend that what was happening was normal or acceptable. I began to see our life together with new clarity, and the picture was ugly. Every interaction with James now revealed his controlling nature, his cruel streak, his fundamental lack of respect for me. I started to understand that what I had called love was really fear, and what I had called peace was really just the absence of conflict at the expense of truth. But understanding didn't immediately translate to action. I remained trapped in the limbo of knowing, but not yet acting, seeing, but not yet changing. It would take another catalyst to push me toward the painful but necessary step of leaving. 3 months after Ethan left, I started seeing a therapist secretly. I told James I was taking an extra shift at the library, but instead, I drove to a neighboring town where I wouldn't be recognized and spent an hour each week with Dr. Unspoken. Melissa Becker, a specialist in family trauma. At first, I was resistant to her gentle probing. I wanted to talk about how to get Ethan back, not about my marriage or my childhood or my patterns of behavior. But Dr. Becker was persistent. "Hannah," she said during our 3rd session, "you keep saying you want to fix your relationship with Ethan, but you're not willing to look at why it broke in the first place." "I know why," I said defensively. "I didn't stand up for him against his father. I get it." "That's what happened, yes," she agreed. "But we need to understand why you made that choice again and again. What was happening inside you that made it seem like the best option?" I didn't have an answer, or rather, I wasn't ready to face the answer. In our 5th session, Dr. Becker asked me to describe a specific incident when James had been cruel to Ethan. I told her about the destroyed diorama when Ethan was 8. "And how did you feel in that moment when James swept Ethan's project to the floor?" she asked. "Horrified," I admitted. "Sick to my stomach. Angry." "And what did you do with those feelings?" "I pushed them down. I focused on fixing the diorama." "Why didn't you express your horror or anger to James?" I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "I couldn't." "Why not?" "Because..." I struggled to articulate what seemed so obvious to me. "Because it would have made things worse. James would have gotten angrier. He might have left. The family would have fallen apart." "So you sacrificed your son's emotional well-being to preserve the family unit." Put so starkly it sounded terrible, but it was the truth. "Yes," I whispered. "And where did you learn that the preservation of family, even a harmful family, was more important than individual well-being?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "My parents," I said softly. "My mother stayed with my father, even though he was cold and controlling. She always said family comes first no matter what." Dr. Becker nodded. "Many of us repeat patterns we learned in childhood, Hannah. We internalize messages about what family means, what love looks like, what we deserve. Your mother taught you that keeping up appearances matters more than emotional health. She taught you that a woman's role is to endure, to smooth things over, to preserve the family at all costs." I felt tears welling in my eyes. "So I'm just like her, doomed to repeat her mistakes?" "Not at all," Dr. Becker said firmly. "You're here, aren't you? You're questioning these patterns. That's the first step toward breaking them." Over the next few weeks, I began to reconnect with friends I'd lost touch with due to James's controlling nature. I started with Leslie, my best friend from college, who had tried to warn me about James all those years ago. "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years, she said when I reached out. "I knew you'd wake up eventually." Leslie had divorced her own husband 5 years earlier after realizing he was a pathological liar. She became my lifeline, meeting me for coffee, sending me encouraging texts, recommending books about emotional abuse and recovery. I devoured those books, recognizing James and myself on every page. I learned about gaslighting, about the cycle of abuse, about how abusers isolate their victims. I learned that my behavior had a name: enabling. and that my fear of confrontation had allowed James' abuse to continue unchecked. It was a painful process facing how complicit I had been in Ethan's suffering. But it was also strangely liberating. For the first time, I had language for what had happened in our home. I could name it, understand it, and therefore begin to change it. 6 months after Ethan left, I had a health scare. Abnormal mammogram results that required further testing. When I told James, his response was predictably self-centered. "Great, now I have to deal with this on top of everything else," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Just make sure your appointments don't interfere with the Henderson dinner next week." I stared at him, seeing with perfect clarity what Ethan had seen all along. A man incapable of genuine empathy, concerned only with appearances and convenience. I called Sophia instead, and she came with me to every appointment holding my hand as we waited for results. "Have you heard from Ethan?" I asked her as we sat in the waiting room. "Yes," she said carefully. "He's doing well. He's taking classes at the community college and working part-time at an art supply store. He's building his portfolio for next year's applications." "Does he ever ask about me?" Sophia hesitated. "Not really, Hannah. He's still processing a lot of hurt." I nodded, accepting this painful truth. "Will you tell him something for me? Tell him I'm starting to understand. Tell him I'm getting help." "I'll tell him," Sophia promised. "But Hannah, he may not be ready to hear it. This isn't something that can be fixed quickly." The tests came back negative. The abnormality was benign, but the experience shook me profoundly. I realized I didn't want to spend whatever years I had left in a marriage devoid of love and respect. I didn't want to die with this regret weighing on my soul. I began to secretly put aside money from my library paycheck, opening a bank account in my name only. I researched apartments, looked into full-time positions at the library, and consulted with a divorce attorney. I was planning my escape, though I still wasn't sure I had the courage to execute it. I decided to write Ethan a letter. A real one this time, not just a card with a check and vague apologies. It took me weeks to write, with many drafts torn up and thrown away. I wanted to get it exactly right, to truly acknowledge what had happened without making excuses. Dear Ethan, there is no adequate way to begin this letter. I'm sorry. Feels laughably insufficient for the harm I've caused you. But I am sorry, deeply, profoundly sorry for failing you as a mother. You were right about everything. Your father's behavior was abusive. I knew it on some level, but I couldn't face it. I told myself I was preserving our family, keeping the peace, but in reality, I was sacrificing you to maintain my own comfort and avoid my own fears. When you found the courage to name what was happening, I betrayed you in the worst possible way. I told you that your reality wasn't real, that your pain wasn't valid. There is no excuse for this. It was cowardice, pure and simple. I want you to know that I'm getting help now. I'm seeing a therapist who is helping me understand the patterns that led me to enable your father's abuse. I'm reconnecting with friends, reading books about emotional abuse, and slowly finding my way toward the truth. I'm not telling you this to ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve that yet, maybe ever. I'm telling you because I want you to know that you were right all along. Your perceptions were accurate. Your feelings were valid. The problem was never you. It was us. It was me. I love you, Ethan. I have always loved you, even when I failed to show it through my actions. If there ever comes a time when you're willing to talk, I'll be here. But I understand if that time never comes. With love and profound regret. Mom. I mailed the letter to Sophia's address, knowing she would give it to Ethan. A week later, it came back unopened, just like the graduation card. But this time, instead of "return to sender," Ethan had written 3 words on the envelope. Not ready yet. Those 3 words gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in months. Not ready yet implied that someday he might be ready. It wasn't a door slammed shut forever, but a boundary set for now. That same week, I hit my own rock bottom. James had been drinking heavily and launched into a tirade about my incompetence after I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. As I stood in our kitchen absorbing his verbal assault, I suddenly saw myself as Ethan must have seen me, a woman allowing herself to be diminished day after day, making excuses for inexcusable behavior. In that moment, something inside me finally broke. Not my spirit, but the chains of fear that had kept me bound to this destructive marriage. I realized that I couldn't expect Ethan to believe I had changed if I was still living with his abuser, still participating in the very dynamic that had driven him away. 2 days later, while James was on a business trip, I packed 4 suitcases with my clothes and personal belongings. I took the photo albums, my jewelry, and a few cherished books. I left almost everything else: the furniture, the appliances, the artwork that had never really been to my taste anyway. I wrote a simple note. James, I've left. I'll have my lawyer contact you about divorce proceedings. Please don't try to contact me. Hannah. I had arranged a small 1-bedroom apartment across town, paid the first and last month's rent with my secret savings, and secured a full-time position at the library. It wasn't much, but it was mine. As I turned the key in the lock of my new place, I felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. At 45 years old, I was finally choosing courage over comfort. My first month in the apartment was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in over 20 years, I was truly on my own. There was no one to criticize my decorating choices, comment on my cooking, or question my whereabouts. The silence was sometimes deafening, but it was also peaceful in a way my marriage had never been. James predictably didn't accept the breakup gracefully. He alternated between angry tirades via text and email and attempts to manipulate me into returning. One day he would tell me I was nothing without him, that I would fail on my own. The next, he would send flowers with notes promising to change, to get help, to be different. I recognized these tactics for what they were: the desperate attempts of an abuser to maintain control. With the help of Dr. Becker and my support system, I held firm. I had my lawyer send a cease and desist letter when his communications became too aggressive, and I blocked his number on my phone. The divorce proceedings were ugly. James tried to paint me as mentally unstable, claimed I had abandoned the marriage without cause, and attempted to hide assets. But my lawyer was experienced with high-conflict divorces and helped me navigate the process. In the end, after nearly a year of legal battles, we reached a settlement that allowed me to maintain my independence. Throughout this time, I continued to work on myself. I increased my therapy sessions to twice weekly, joined a support group for people leaving abusive relationships, and read every book I could find on emotional recovery. I was determined that if Ethan ever gave me another chance, I would be a healthier, stronger person than the mother he had known. I learned to identify my patterns of avoidance and people-pleasing that had allowed James' abuse to continue unchecked. I recognized how my own childhood had primed me to accept unacceptable behavior, to value peace over truth, appearance over reality. I began to understand that true love requires courage, the courage to set boundaries, to face conflict, to stand up for oneself and others. The process wasn't linear. I had days of progress followed by days of crippling guilt and self-doubt. Sometimes the weight of my failure as a mother felt so heavy I could barely function. But slowly, inch by inch, I began to forge a new identity, not just as James's wife or Ethan's mother, but as Hannah, a woman with her own values, boundaries, and strength. Throughout this time, I continued to reach out to Ethan, though I was careful not to overwhelm him. I sent emails on his birthday and holidays, always brief, always acknowledging his need for space, while letting him know I was still here, still working on myself, still hoping for a chance to make amends. "I'm respecting your boundary of not ready yet," I wrote in one email. "I just want you to know that whenever or if ever you are ready, I'll be here." I'm continuing therapy and learning more every day about healthy relationships and boundaries. I love you, and I'm proud of you for protecting yourself in a way I failed to do. Months passed with no response. I tried not to take it personally, to understand that Ethan's silence wasn't about punishing me, but about protecting himself. I had to earn back his trust, and that would take time, if it happened at all. Through Sophia, I learned that Ethan had been accepted to CalArts with a substantial scholarship supplemented by financial aid he qualified for as an independent student. I sent him a simple congratulatory email. I heard about CalArts. I'm so incredibly proud of you. You deserve this recognition of your talent. 2 days later, I received my first direct communication from Ethan in over a year. I'm well. Just 2 words, but they were enough to bring me to tears. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. A tiny crack in the wall between us. During this period, I threw myself into learning everything I could about trauma and its effects on children. I took a course on trauma-informed care at the community college, volunteered at a domestic abuse center, and attended workshops on supporting survivors. I needed to understand, really understand, what Ethan had experienced growing up in our home. What I learned broke my heart all over again. I came to understand how chronic emotional abuse affects a child's developing brain, how it shapes their sense of self-worth, how it influences their ability to form healthy relationships. I realized that the damage James and I had done wouldn't be undone with a few apologies or months of therapy. It would take years for Ethan to heal, if he ever fully could. This knowledge was painful but necessary. It helped me develop realistic expectations about what reconciliation with Ethan might look like. I couldn't expect him to simply forgive and forget to welcome me back into his life as if nothing had happened. If he ever allowed me back in, it would be on his terms and his time, and I would need to accept whatever boundaries he set. My volunteer work at the Domestic Abuse Center became a source of healing for me as well. Twice a week, I staffed their helpline, talking to women in situations frighteningly similar to the one I had been in. I helped them develop safety plans, connected them with resources, and sometimes just listened as they described what they were enduring. Many of these women had children, and they often expressed guilt about exposing their kids to abuse. I was able to share my experience without judgment to validate their fears, while encouraging them to take steps to protect both themselves and their children. In helping others, I found a purpose that gave meaning to my own suffering. As my divorce was finalized and my new life took shape, I began to reconnect with parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I took a watercolor class, remembering how I had enjoyed painting in college before I met James. I joined a book club at the library, reveling in discussions about literature without fear of being called pretentious or wasteful of time. I made new friends who knew me only as Hannah, not as James' wife or Ethan's mother. About 18 months after Ethan left, Sophia called to tell me he was having his first gallery showing at CalArts. "It's a student exhibition," she said. "Nothing major, but a big deal for a first-year student. I'm flying out for it." "Do you think I could come?" I asked hesitantly. There was a long pause. "I don't know, Hannah. I'd have to ask him if he's comfortable with that." A week later, Sophia called back. "He said he can't stop you from coming since it's a public event, but he's not ready to interact with you there. If you decide to go, he asks that you keep your distance." It wasn't the welcome I had hoped for, but it was more than I deserved. I booked a flight to California and a hotel room near the campus. The evening of the exhibition, I dressed carefully in a simple black dress and arrived 30 minutes after the event started. I spotted Ethan immediately standing beside his work, talking animatedly with a group of students and faculty. He looked different, more confident, his hair longer, his clothes artistic and individual, in a way he'd never been able to express at home. He looked happy. I kept my distance as promised, moving slowly through the exhibition, taking in the other students' work before making my way to Ethan's display. His pieces were powerful, a series of mixed media works exploring themes of silence, voice, and liberation. One piece in particular caught my breath, a figure emerging from what appeared to be a shattered mirror reaching toward light. I stood before it, tears in my eyes, understanding that I was looking at my son's healing journey rendered in art. I felt someone beside me and turned to find Sophia. "It's remarkable, isn't he?" she said softly. "Yes," I whispered. "He's incredible." "He sees you," Sophia said. "He knows you're here. He's not ready to talk, but he didn't ask you to leave. That's something." I nodded, wiping away tears. "That's more than something. It's everything right now." I left without approaching Ethan, honoring his boundary. But as I walked toward the exit, I caught his eye across the room. I didn't wave or smile or make any gesture that would put pressure on him. I simply held his gaze for a moment, hoping my eyes could convey what words had failed to my pride, my regret, my love. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before turning back to his conversation. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. I flew home the next day with a catalog from the exhibition and a new understanding that respecting Ethan's boundaries, truly honoring his need for distance, was perhaps the first genuine act of love I had shown him in years. Not love as possession or control or even connection, but love as the willingness to put his needs above my desire for forgiveness. It was a bittersweet realization, but also a hopeful one. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new kind of relationship, one based on truth rather than denial, respect rather than fear, boundaries rather than obligation. Perhaps, in letting go of my desperate need for reconciliation, I was creating the very conditions that might someday make it possible. 3 years passed from the day Ethan walked out of our house. In that time, I built a life I never could have imagined when I was trapped in my marriage with James. My small house, purchased with my portion of the divorce settlement, became a true home, filled with colors James would have hated art. I chose myself and furniture arranged for comfort rather than appearance. My work at the library expanded into a role developing community outreach programs, including a series of workshops for families about healthy communication. I continued volunteering at the Domestic Abuse Center, eventually joining their board of directors and helping to develop education programs for schools about recognizing the signs of emotional abuse. I maintained my therapy with Dr. Becker, though we had reduced sessions to once a month as I grew stronger and more secure in my new life. I had developed genuine friendships, reconnected with my sister Sophia, and even cautiously begun dating, though I was in no rush to enter another relationship. My contact with Ethan remained minimal, but had gradually increased. After the gallery showing, we occasionally exchanged brief emails. He would share news about his studies or a new art technique he was exploring. I would tell him about my volunteer work or a book I was reading. We carefully avoided anything too personal, too painful, but it was communication, a tenuous bridge being rebuilt one plank at a time. I heard from Sophia that Ethan was thriving at CalArts. His work had been included in several student exhibitions, and one of his professors had connected him with a small gallery in Los Angeles that was interested in his work after graduation. He had made friends, was dating, and seemed to be healing from the wounds of his childhood. I took comfort in his success while accepting that I couldn't take credit for it. Ethan was flourishing not because of my parenting, but despite it. His resilience and talent were his own, not gifts I could claim to have given him. One ordinary Tuesday in April, I received a postcard in the mail. The image on the front was of a large-scale art installation, a room-sized creation of light and shadow that seemed to shift and transform depending on the viewer's perspective. I turned it over and saw Ethan's handwriting, my first major installation, opening at Horizon Gallery, Los Angeles, May 15th. There was no message beyond this information, but the fact that he had sent it at all felt significant. It wasn't an invitation exactly, but it was a sharing of something important to him. I wrote back carefully a brief note congratulating him on this achievement and telling him how striking the installation looked. I ended with, "I'm proud of the artist and person you've become," deliberately making no mention of coming to see it, putting no pressure on him to respond. 2 months later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We'll be in Seattle next weekend. Coffee Saturday 10 a.m., Blackbird Cafe on Pike." Ethan. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding. After nearly 4 years, Ethan was willing to see me face to face. It felt monumental and terrifying all at once. I replied simply, "I'll be there. Thank you." The days leading up to Saturday were a blur of anxiety and hope. I talked through my feelings with Dr. Becker, trying to maintain realistic expectations while allowing myself to feel cautiously optimistic. "Remember," Dr. Becker said, "this meeting is not about you getting the forgiveness you want. It's about Ethan getting the acknowledgement he needs. Focus on listening, not explaining or defending." The morning of our meeting, I dressed carefully in a casual outfit that felt authentic to who I was now. No more perfect suburban mother facade. I arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early, too nervous to sit still at home, and found a small table near the window. At precisely 10 a.m., Ethan walked in. He was 21 now, a young man rather than the boy who had left our home. He moved with a confidence I had never seen in him before, scanning the cafe before his eyes found mine. He gave a small smile, cautious but genuine, and made his way to my table. "Hi, Mom," he said simply, sitting down across from me. "Hi, Ethan," I replied, fighting the urge to reach for him to touch his hand or arm to confirm he was really here. "Thank you for suggesting this." We ordered coffee, and for a few moments we engaged in careful small talk. The weather in Seattle compared to Los Angeles, his flight, the cafe's interesting decor. Then there was a pause, a deep breath from both of us, and we stepped into more honest territory. "I've been in therapy," Ethan said, "for about 2 years now. It's been helpful." I nodded. "I'm glad. I've been in therapy too. It's helped me understand a lot about myself and about what happened in our family." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Ethan said, his voice steady. "My therapist suggested that at some point, if I felt ready, it might be healing to have a conversation with you about the past. Not to rehash every painful moment, but to see if you and I have reached a shared understanding of what happened." I took a deep breath. "I would welcome that, but only if you're truly ready." Ethan looked me in the eye. "I think I am, but I need to know first. Do you still believe I was overreacting? Do you still think what Dad did wasn't abuse?" It was the most direct question he could have asked, cutting straight to the heart of my betrayal. I met his gaze without flinching. "No, Ethan, I don't believe that at all, and I haven't for a long time. What your father did was emotional abuse. His criticism, his control, his dismissal of your feelings and talents, all of it was abusive. And my failure to protect you, my enabling of his behavior, my gaslighting of your experience, that was abusive too. You weren't overreacting. If anything, you were underreacting to years of trauma." Ethan's expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders relax slightly. "Why did you say it then, that night when I finally stood up to him?" I could have given him the easy answer, that I was afraid, that I was trying to keep the peace. But he deserved the whole truth. "I said it because I wasn't ready to face what it would mean if you were right," I said. "If what James was doing was abuse, then it meant our entire family was built on a lie. It meant I had failed you in the most fundamental way. It meant I would have to take action to change everything. And I was too cowardly to do that, so I denied your reality instead. It was the most shameful moment of my life." Ethan nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that, for acknowledging it. I want you to know, I continued, that I've spent these years trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could do that to her child. I've been learning about the patterns from my own childhood that made me vulnerable to someone like your father, about the ways I normalized behavior that should have horrified me. I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did. Nothing can excuse it. But I want you to know that I've been doing the work to make sure I never harm anyone that way again. I've heard some of that from Aunt Sophia, Ethan said, about the volunteering you do the workshops. We talked for over 2 hours, moving from coffee to lunch, as we carefully navigated the painful terrain of our shared past. Ethan shared some of what therapy had taught him about the effects of growing up in an emotionally abusive home, the hypervigilance, the self-doubt, the difficulty trusting others. I listened without defensiveness, accepting the reality of the harm that had been done. I shared my journey since he left, the painful awakening, the divorce, the rebuilding of my life on more honest foundations. I told him about the domestic abuse center and the families I worked with, about how his courage had ultimately inspired my own. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. There were moments of tension, brief flares of old pain. But there was also something new emerging between us. A careful respect, an acknowledgement of each other as whole people, rather than just mother and son. As our time together drew to a close, Ethan said, "I'm not ready for a regular relationship yet. I still have a lot of healing to do, but I'd like to stay in touch more consistently, if that's okay with you." "Of course," I said, trying to keep the overwhelming gratitude from my voice. "Whatever works for you, whatever boundaries you need. I'm just grateful for any place in your life you're willing to give me." As we stood to leave, Ethan hesitated for a moment, then gave me a brief light hug, our first physical contact in almost 4 years. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like a miracle. "I'll text you when I'm back in Seattle," he said. "Maybe around the holidays." "I'd like that," I replied. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. I'm so proud of the person you've become." Walking home from that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief for the years and trust we had lost, guilt for my role in causing that loss, but also a tentative hope for the future. Not hope for a return to some idealized mother-son relationship that had never really existed, but hope for something new and more authentic to emerge from the ashes of what had been destroyed. I had learned the hardest lesson of my life, that love is not about maintaining a comfortable facade or preserving a family structure at all costs. True love requires courage. The courage to face uncomfortable truths, to set and respect boundaries, to prioritize well-being over appearances. I had learned that denial, no matter how well-intentioned, is never an act of love, but always an act of fear. I don't know what the future holds for Ethan and me. The damage done cannot be undone, only acknowledged and gradually healed over time. But I do know that whatever relationship we build going forward will be based on honesty, rather than denial, respect, rather than fear, truth, rather than comfort. I lost my son when I chose denial over love, when I told him his pain wasn't real. I may never fully get him back, but in facing that truth, I found myself. And maybe someday we'll find a new way to be family, one built on the courage to see each other clearly in all our brokenness and all our strength. If my story resonates with you today, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between comfortable denial and painful truth? If you know someone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics, please share this video with them. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more stories of healing and transformation. Remember, sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Thank you for listening to my journey.